The 1950s are often remembered as a glamorous era of American cars, chrome, tail fins, and gas-guzzling V8s. But beneath the shiny exteriors lurked lethal machines designed with style over substance. These cars didn't just fail at safety, they actively killed people. Automakers either ignored or dismissed safety, producing vehicles that were dangerously unstable, poorly engineered, and completely unfit for human transport. Here's a merciless look at 9 of the worst cars of the 1950s that caused countless deaths, machines that were basically rolling coffins. Dear viewer, we have set a goal of reaching 30,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and we would love for you to join us. Thank you for your support. Number 9. When Mercury introduced the Monterey in 1950, it represented the brand's move into the luxury mid-tier, a car designed to sit proudly between Ford's affordability and Lincoln's elegance. With gleaming chrome, smooth lines, and the promise of effortless power, the Monterey embodied early 1950s American motoring confidence. Yet beneath that glamorous exterior was a deeply flawed machine. A heavy cruiser that couldn't stop safely, turned dangerously at high speeds, and reflected the pre-safety era's tragic disregard for vehicle dynamics. Between 1950 and 1954, the Mercury Monterey became a status symbol, but it also became a silent hazard on American highways. A car whose impressive weight and poor braking made it a danger not only to its passengers, but also to everyone around it. After World War II, America was booming. Highways were expanding, gas was cheap, and the public wanted big, powerful cars that symbolized prosperity. The 1950 Mercury Monterey arrived as a high-end trim level, eventually evolving into its own model line by 1952. It was a striking vehicle, long, low, and adorned with chrome from bumper to bumper. Under its hood lay Ford's trusted flathead V8, producing roughly 110 to 125 horsepower, depending on the year. For its time, that was ample power, propelling the Monterey to speeds above 90 miles per hour. But while the engine was modernized, the rest of the car's dynamics, particularly its suspension and braking systems, were relics of the 1930s. This imbalance between power and control would soon prove deadly. The Mercury Monterey weighed between 3,600 and 4,100 pounds, depending on the body style, a heavy mass for its relatively simple chassis design. That weight, combined with a high center of gravity and soft suspension, gave the car a comfortable boulevard ride, but disastrous handling at speed. During cornering, especially on curved highways or wet surfaces, the Monterey's body rolled dramatically. Drivers reported feeling as though the car was leaning off the road, a sensation that wasn't far from reality. With its leaf spring rear suspension and primitive shocks, it could lose traction suddenly, sending the car into uncontrolled slides or rollovers. In the 1950s, stability control and modern sway bars didn't exist. Once a car like the Monterey began to tip, the sheer weight of its roofline and body momentum often ensured it rolled completely, crushing occupants inside. The most critical flaw of the early Mercury Monterey was its weak hydraulic drum brake system. All 4 wheels used drum brakes, a standard design for the era, but Mercury's were particularly prone to fade under repeated use. After a few hard stops, heat buildup caused the brakes to lose their friction. On mountain descents or during emergency braking at highway speeds, the pedal often went soft, and the stopping distance could exceed 250 feet, a terrifying figure for a car of that size. Worse, there was no dual master cylinder. If a brake line failed, the entire braking system failed. Many accidents reported in the early 1950s involved the Mercurys that simply could not stop in time, a design flaw shared by other Ford and Mercury models of the era. The combination of heavy mass, soft suspension, narrow bias ply tires, and fading brakes made the Monterey one of the more accident-prone luxury cars of its time. On modern highways, it would be considered dangerously unstable. At speeds over 70 miles per hour, steering precision degraded significantly. The recirculating ball steering system required multiple turns lock to lock, and even a small correction at high speed could send the car weaving. When paired with body roll, drivers frequently overcorrected, flipping the car during recovery. Highway patrols in California and Arizona during the early 1950s noted an unusual number of single-vehicle rollover fatalities involving Mercury and Lincoln models. Investigations pointed toward poor suspension geometry and brake fade as contributing factors. In the early 1950s, American automakers sold dreams, not safety. Mercury's advertisements spoke of jet-smooth power, luxury ride, and effortless control, but never mentioned the car's ability or inability to protect occupants. The Monterey's interior was a sea of metal and chrome, with a rigid steering column aimed directly at the driver's chest. Dashboards were unpadded, door panels were sharp-edged, and seatbelts were non-existent. In head-on collisions, the steering wheel often impaled the driver. In rollovers, the heavy roof structure and thin A-pillars collapsed inward, offering virtually no survival space. Many post-crash photos from the era show the roofline crushed down to the dashboard, a grim testament to the lack of structural integrity. The Monterey was marketed as a performer, a car that could float down the highway with V8 confidence. But that confidence was misplaced. While it accelerated briskly for its size, its cornering and braking performance lagged far behind. By 1953, Mercury offered an overhead valve Y-block V8 with even more power, reaching up to 125 horsepower. Yet the brakes and suspension remained nearly unchanged. The result was an even faster car with the same inability to stop or turn safely. Enthusiasts loved the car's straight-line speed and styling until they experienced its terrifying limitations in real driving conditions. Contemporary newspaper archives and insurance records from 1952 to 1954 note multiple fatal crashes involving Mercury Montereys, often described as loss of control or rollover accidents. In most of these cases, drivers were traveling at moderate highway speeds, 60 to 70 miles per hour, when the car failed to respond predictably to steering or braking inputs. Because of its soft suspension and weight distribution, once the rear end began to slide, recovery was nearly impossible. On narrow two-lane roads, these incidents frequently ended with the car overturning into ditches or rolling multiple times. Passengers had almost no chance of survival in such events. By 1955, Mercury redesigned the Monterey on a more modern chassis with improved brakes and better weight distribution, but the damage had been done. The early models, while stylish and iconic, left a legacy of safety shortcomings that reflected Detroit's priorities at the time: power, prestige, and comfort, not protection. The tragedy was that the Monterey had so much potential. It was beautifully built, smooth, and elegant. Yet in an era when cars were getting faster every year, Mercury failed to match power with control. Today, the 1950 to 1954 Mercury Monterey holds an important, if sobering, place in automotive history. Collectors admire its classic lines, lead sled stance, and V8 charm, but few forget its shortcomings. It serves as a reminder of the pre-safety mentality, when engineering focused on aesthetics and luxury, while ignoring the fundamental physics of motion and impact. The Monterey's era was of chrome dreams and mechanical excess, a time when crumple zones, seatbelts, or safety glass were not standard. It was remembered both as a beautiful artifact of 1950s optimism and as a warning of how deadly that optimism could be when paired with poor engineering foresight. The 1950 to 1954 Mercury Monterey was a masterpiece of post-war design and ambition, but a nightmare of pre-safety engineering. Its combination of heavy mass, weak brakes, and soft suspension created a car that could cruise in style but not stop or steer with confidence. It reflected a time when more meant better. More weight, more chrome, more horsepower, even if it also meant more danger. In hindsight, the Monterey reminds us that luxury without control is an illusion, and beauty without safety can be deadly. It was, in every sense, a rolling monument to excess and a silent killer of its own success. Number 8. The Chevrolet 210, produced from 1953 to 1957, was one of the most common cars on American roads during the post-war boom. Marketed as a practical, no-nonsense alternative to the luxurious Bel Air, it was aimed at middle-class families and working-class buyers who wanted dependable transportation without extra flash. But beneath its affordable charm and solid looks, the 210 hid a chilling truth. It was one of the most unsafe cars of its era. Chevrolet engineers in the early 1950s prioritized style, cost-cutting, and simplicity over structural integrity. The 210 shared its body shell with the Bel Air and the lower-end 150, meaning the same weak frame construction was used across the board. Safety was barely an afterthought. Seatbelts were not offered as standard, and few buyers opted for them even when available as an accessory. The idea of passive restraint systems was still considered unnecessary by most manufacturers. The car's bench seats had no lateral support or anchoring, meaning that in a collision, passengers could easily be flung forward or sideways with full force. One of the most notorious design flaws of the Chevrolet 210 was its solid steel dashboard. In a frontal impact, the driver and front passenger had no cushioning between them and a wall of metal. Even low-speed crashes often resulted in fatal head and chest injuries due to blunt trauma. The steering column, made of rigid steel, would not collapse. It often acted as a spear aimed directly at the driver. Safety glass for windshields had improved since the 1930s, but it was still primitive by today's standards. Shattered glass could easily slice into occupants, compounding the already horrific injuries caused by the car's unyielding cabin structure. The Chevrolet 210's body-on-frame design lacked crumple zones, a concept that wouldn't become mainstream until the late 1960s. Instead of absorbing impact energy, the frame transmitted it directly into the cabin. Even moderate frontal or side collisions could cause severe intrusion into the passenger space. Door latches were also a problem. In major crashes, they frequently failed, throwing occupants out of the car, which almost always resulted in death or severe injury. During rollover accidents, which were not uncommon due to bias-ply tires and soft suspensions, the roof structure offered virtually no protection. While the 210 was mechanically reliable, it was not built for emergency maneuvers. The car's primitive suspension and drum brakes made it dangerously unstable during panic stops. The brakes faded under heat, requiring much longer stopping distances. Combined with narrow tires and a soft suspension setup, this meant the car had poor traction and unpredictable handling, especially on wet or uneven roads. Even though the 210 was slower than the more powerful Bel Airs and Corvettes of its time, its lack of safety made it just as deadly when things went wrong. In the 1950s, Americans were infatuated with chrome, curves, and V8 power, not safety features. The Chevrolet 210 fit perfectly into this cultural moment, affordable, attractive, and aspirational for working families. Few questioned its lack of safety until the late 1960s, when Ralph Nader's "Unsafe at Any Speed" brought national attention to design neglect in Detroit. By then, many 210s had already been scrapped or involved in fatal crashes, their flaws hidden beneath the nostalgia of the era. Today, the Chevrolet 210 is remembered as a beloved classic for collectors, admired for its timeless Tri-5 styling. But from a safety perspective, it stands as a reminder of how little protection early car buyers had. Its unbelted interiors, rigid steering columns, and metal dashboards make it one of the most dangerous family cars ever produced by Chevrolet. When viewed through the lens of modern automotive safety, the 210 is not just a relic, it's a cautionary tale from a time when survival was never part of the design brief. In summary, the 1953 to 1957 Chevrolet 210 embodied America's post-war optimism, but lacked every meaningful safety feature we take for granted today. What it offered in affordability and charm, it took away in survivability. A car that worked for your wallet, but not for your life. Number 7. The Plymouth Savoy, produced between 1953 and 1956, was part of Chrysler Corporation's early post-war push into the affordable family car market. It was meant to offer working-class Americans a step up from the Spartan Plymouth Plaza, positioned just below the Belvedere. Though reliable and modestly attractive, the Savoy became infamous for one chilling reason: its steering column, which in many crashes acted less like a control device and more like a deadly spear aimed at the driver's chest. The early 1950s marked the height of America's post-war car craze. Manufacturers were focused on chrome, comfort, and cost, not safety. Seatbelts, padded dashboards, and energy-absorbing steering systems were virtually non-existent in mainstream cars. The Plymouth Savoy exemplified this mindset. Its advertising emphasized durability, smooth performance, and modern design, but never safety. Buyers were reassured by Plymouth's reputation for reliability, not realizing that the car's structural design could turn a minor collision into a fatal one. The Savoy's non-collapsible steering column was connected directly to the steering box via a rigid steel shaft. In a frontal impact, the solid column had nowhere to go. The force of the collision drove the steering wheel straight backward toward the driver's torso. Crash reports from the era frequently described impalement or crushing injuries even at moderate speeds, around 30 to 40 miles per hour. Because there was no steering column energy absorption or deformation zone, the entire impact load was transferred directly to the driver. This defect wasn't unique to Plymouth, but the Savoy's cab-forward design and driving position made it especially dangerous. The driver sat close to the wheel, with minimal space between chest and steering rim, leaving virtually no survival zone in a frontal crash. Beyond the steering column hazard, the Savoy's interior was a sea of hard metal. The dashboard was pressed steel, and knobs and trim pieces were made from unforgiving chrome-plated metal. In an impact, occupants could easily suffer facial lacerations, skull fractures, or blunt trauma from hitting the dashboard or instrument cluster. Plymouth marketed the car's interior as beautifully durable, but that durability came at a deadly cost. Safety glass existed, but it was basic laminated glass that could still fragment into sharp edges. The steering wheel itself was rigid, without the energy-absorbing spokes later introduced in the 1960s. Like most cars of the early 1950s, the Savoy had no crumple zones. The frame was designed to stay rigid in collisions, a philosophy that, at the time, was thought to protect occupants. In reality, this rigidity simply transferred all crash energy into the cabin. Seatbelts were not standard, and few Savoy buyers opted for them as accessories. During high-speed impacts, unbelted drivers were thrown forward violently into the steering wheel or windshield. Many fatal crash investigations noted that, had seatbelts been present, injuries might have been survivable even with the steering column hazard. Mechanically, the Plymouth Savoy was serviceable but outdated. Early models featured flathead six-cylinder engines with modest power, while braking systems used drum brakes on all four wheels, prone to fade during heavy use. The combination of weak braking and a soft suspension meant the car handled poorly in emergencies. Drivers often couldn't stop in time or steer effectively to avoid obstacles, and when they did crash, the consequences were catastrophic due to the interior's lethal rigidity. During the 1950s, fatal car accidents were rising nationwide, yet automakers largely avoided the topic of safety. The Plymouth Savoy, despite its potential, never faced public scandal during its production years. The industry's silence was partly cultural. Drivers were expected to accept the risks of motoring as part of progress. It wasn't until the late 1960s, when consumer advocates like Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, that the dangers of rigid steering columns were fully exposed to the public. By then, thousands of deaths from impalement injuries had already occurred, many involving cars like the Savoy. The Plymouth Savoy's steering column hazard became a key lesson in automotive engineering history. By the mid-1960s, U.S. safety regulations mandated collapsible steering columns designed to compress or shear during impacts, drastically reducing impalement injuries. Energy-absorbing dashboards, padded interiors, and seatbelts became standard by the early 1970s, innovations that might have saved countless Savoy drivers 2 decades earlier. Today, the Savoy is remembered fondly for collectors for mid-century styling and simplicity, but it also stands as a grim reminder of the pre-safety era, when human lives were often sacrificed for cost efficiency and aesthetic appeal. The 1953 to 1956 Plymouth Savoy was more than just a family car. It was a reflection of an era that prized affordability and appearance over human safety. Its solid steering column turned every front-end crash into a potential impalement, and its all-metal cabin provided no mercy to those inside. The Savoy teaches us that automotive safety wasn't always a given. It was a hard-earned evolution born from the blood and wreckage of cars like this one. What was once a symbol of middle-class progress now serves as a historical warning. Without engineering for survival, style and reliability mean nothing. Number 6. The Studebaker Commander, produced between 1950 and 1955, is often remembered as one of America's most strikingly styled cars of the early post-war period. With its futuristic, aircraft-inspired design, it captured the optimism of the early 1950s, an era when automakers were eager to shed pre-war aesthetics and embrace the jet age. But beneath that sleek, progressive body was a deeply flawed machine. The Commander's poor handling, underpowered braking system, and fragile roof structure turned it into a beautiful but dangerous car, one that too often claimed lives when style met physics on the open road. Studebaker entered the 1950s with bold ambition. Unlike the Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, Studebaker was an independent automaker, relying on innovation and design flair to compete. Its 1950 Commander, with its bullet-nose front end and wraparound styling, looked like nothing else on the road. It projected speed and modernity, even while standing still. However, behind that daring design, Studebaker lacked the engineering resources to refine its mechanical systems to match the car's futuristic image. While competitors were investing heavily in handling, braking, and safety improvements, Studebaker's focus was on appearances and marketing. The Commander's handling was one of its most serious flaws. The car used a front coil spring and rear leaf spring suspension setup that was not properly tuned for stability. Engineers prioritized ride comfort over control, leading to excessive body roll in corners and poor response during emergency maneuvers. The steering was vague and heavy, with too many turns lock to lock, meaning the driver had to rotate the wheel dramatically to make quick directional changes. This made it nearly impossible to avoid hazards at highway speeds. Even worse, the Commander's weight distribution was front-biased, giving it significant understeer. When drivers attempted sudden turns or lane changes, the car's front tires lost grip first, sending the vehicle plowing straight ahead. Many accidents were recorded as loss of control on curves, a euphemism for what was essentially poor chassis dynamics. Braking was another major concern. The Commander came equipped with four-wheel hydraulic drum brakes, which were already an outdated system by the mid-1950s. While adequate for city speeds, they were prone to brake fade when descending long hills or stopping repeatedly. Under heavy braking, heat buildup caused the brake linings to glaze and lose friction, effectively reducing stopping power when it was needed most. This failure was particularly dangerous during tire blowouts or emergency stops, where the car's mass and poor balance made it nearly uncontrollable. Contemporary road tests noted that the Commander required distances up to 200 feet to come to a complete stop from 60 miles per hour, far longer than many competitors. Drivers who assumed the car could handle modern traffic conditions often found themselves unable to stop in time to avoid collisions. The early 1950s were notorious for unreliable bias-ply tires, which were prone to blowouts at high speeds. In the Commander, a sudden loss of tire pressure was catastrophic. The car's soft suspension and narrow track width made it extremely difficult to control after a blowout. When a front tire burst, the car would jerk violently to one side, often leading to rollovers or skids. When a rear tire blew, the car tended to fishtail uncontrollably due to the suspension's poor damping. Drivers frequently overcorrected, sending the vehicle into spins or flips. Because the Commander's roof structure lacked proper reinforcement, many rollover crashes resulted in complete roof collapse, crushing occupants beneath. The thin steel pillars and unbraced roof rails were no match for the car's own weight during a flip. Survivors were rare in such incidents. Studebaker's body designs emphasized style over strength. The thin pillars and wide glass areas gave the Commander its elegant, airy appearance, but they also made it dangerously weak. In rollovers, the A and B pillars folded instantly, and the roof caved in within milliseconds. This structural weakness wasn't publicly acknowledged by the company, but accident investigators and insurers quickly noticed. Photographs of crash scenes often showed the car flattened, almost to the level of the doors. The high mortality rate in Commander rollovers became one of the darker legacies of Studebaker engineering. Studebaker marketed the Commander as an advanced automobile, boasting about its aerodynamics, airplane-inspired design, and optional overdrive for improved fuel economy. But these marketing points masked the underlying engineering shortcomings. Even Studebaker's attempts at modernization, such as introducing the V8 Commander in 1951, didn't solve its safety problems. The car became faster, but its suspension and brakes weren't upgraded to match the power increase, making it even more dangerous at speed. Owners and collectors often describe the Commander as a car ahead of its time, but in reality it was a car beyond its limits. The combination of high center of gravity, poor weight balance, and weak brakes made it a rolling hazard. Newspaper archives from the early 1950s include numerous accident reports involving Commanders that left the roadway or overturned during evasive action. Many of these ended in fatalities due to roof collapse or steering column intrusion. The irony is painful. A car styled like a jet plane often ended up flipping like one during takeoff. By 1955, Studebaker's reputation for quality and safety was deteriorating. The Commander's handling flaws and accident record didn't help. Competitors like Ford, Chevrolet, and Plymouth began introducing safer, more predictable vehicles, and Studebaker struggled to keep up. Sales plummeted, and the company entered a long decline that would ultimately end its American production by 1966. The Commander, once a symbol of post-war progress, became a cautionary tale of what happens when styling outpaces engineering. The 1950 to 1955 Studebaker Commander is now a beloved classic in car shows and museums, admired for its jet-age flair. Yet behind its beauty lies a legacy of tragedy. Its weak brakes, unstable chassis, and flimsy roof structure made it one of the more dangerous cars of its era, particularly in the hands of inexperienced drivers or families unaware of its flaws. Modern safety engineering, including reinforced passenger cells, crumple zones, and rollover protection, owes part of its development to cars like the Commander. The failures of that era forced the industry to confront hard truths about design priorities. The Studebaker Commander, 1950 to 1955, was a car of contradictions, visually futuristic but mechanically primitive. It looked like tomorrow, but handled like yesterday. Its beauty masked an unsettling truth. This was a car that could kill its occupants as easily as it could charm onlookers. In the history of automotive design, the Commander stands as a tragic reminder that a car can look fast and modern while being dangerously unsafe. It is both an icon of post-war optimism and a warning from a time before safety became a science. Number 5. The Ford Mainline, 1952 to 1954, stands as one of the starkest examples of post-war America's dangerous obsession with affordability over safety. Designed to be a stripped-down, entry-level car for working-class buyers, the Mainline was cheap to buy, easy to maintain, and horrifyingly unsafe in even moderate accidents. At a time when the automobile was becoming a symbol of progress and prosperity, the Ford Mainline represented something else entirely: the perilous trade-off between cost and human life. It was built to a price, not a standard, and thousands of families paid that price on the highway. In the early 1950s, Ford Motor Company was battling Chevrolet and Plymouth for dominance in America's booming post-war car market. With returning veterans, young families, and first-time buyers flooding dealerships, Ford saw an opportunity to create a bare-bones vehicle that anyone could afford. The result was the Ford Mainline, introduced for the 1952 model year as the lowest rung in Ford's lineup, below the Custom Line and Crest Line. It came with minimal chrome, plain steel wheels and almost no standard equipment. Inside, it featured rubber floor mats instead of carpet, and many versions lacked heaters or radios entirely. But what Ford didn't advertise was that the Mainline also lacked something far more critical: safety engineering. The Mainline's body was constructed with thin-gauge steel, far lighter and less rigid than the materials used in higher-priced Fords. Engineers deliberately reduced structural bracing in the doors and roof pillars to cut manufacturing costs and improve fuel economy. The result was a car that looked sturdy, but in reality was alarmingly fragile. In side impacts, the doors buckled inward with almost no resistance. The roof could deform under its own weight if a car flipped or rolled. Even minor fender benders often resulted in severe cabin intrusion, with dashboards and steering columns collapsing toward occupants. Crash reconstruction studies conducted decades later showed that the Mainline's A-pillars, front roof supports, offered almost no resistance to compression. In a 30-mile-per-hour offset frontal collision, the front structure folded like tin foil, pushing the steering column directly toward the driver's chest. Unlike modern cars that are designed to absorb and dissipate crash energy, the Ford Mainline transmitted nearly all impact force directly to the occupants. The solid steering column and unpadded metal dashboard turned every collision into a potentially fatal event. The car had no crumple zones, no side impact protection, and no seatbelts, because seatbelts were still considered unnecessary extras. Buyers could not even order them as an option in most years. The doors were particularly weak. Ford engineers used thin, single-skin steel panels with minimal reinforcement beams. In side collisions, the doors often tore away from their hinges, ejecting passengers onto the road. Many accident reports from the early 1950s describe Mainlines that were split open like a can, a gruesome phrase repeated by state troopers and coroners alike. The Mainline was cheap, and that was its greatest selling point. It cost around $1,500, significantly less than a Crestline or Chevrolet Bel Air. For many low-income families, it was the only way to own a new car. But that affordability masked the danger. The people who bought Mainlines were often young couples, rural workers, or families who needed reliable transportation but couldn't afford mid-tier models. They used the car for long commutes and highway travel, situations where its lack of safety features became deadly. Insurance companies began noticing a pattern. Mainlines were disproportionately represented in fatal crashes compared to other Fords. Their light structure, poor brakes, and lack of stability on uneven roads made them unsafe at any significant speed. Most Mainlines were equipped with Ford's flathead V8 or a six-cylinder engine, modest by modern standards, but capable of pushing the car to 70 or 80 miles per hour. The issue wasn't speed, it was control. The Mainline used bias-ply tires, vague steering, and drum brakes that faded after only a few stops. It handled poorly on gravel or wet pavement, and sudden maneuvers could send it fishtailing. Combined with its weak frame, even minor collisions could be catastrophic. In many accidents, the steering column speared drivers in the chest, a common fatal injury in early 1950s cars. Survivors often suffered massive head trauma from striking the steel dashboard or stain windshield. Highway patrol archives and period accident photos tell a grim story. A single front-end impact could compress the Mainline's front end all the way to the firewall. The engine, mounted close to the passenger compartment, often tore loose from its mounts, pushing into the cabin. A famous example involved a 1953 Mainline that collided with a delivery truck in Ohio. The front structure folded completely and both front occupants were killed instantly, despite the low speed of the crash. Police investigators noted that the cabin collapsed to the seat line. These weren't isolated events. Insurance investigators found that the Mainline's cabin survival rate in frontal impacts was among the worst in its class, significantly lower than comparable Chevrolets or Plymouths. At the time, there were no federal safety standards for passenger vehicles. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration didn't exist yet, and automakers faced no requirements for crash testing or occupant protection. Ford, like most car makers, viewed safety as a selling obstacle, not a selling point. When buyers raised concerns, dealers assured them that careful driving was the only protection they needed. The Mainline's advertisements focused on thrift, simplicity, and Ford quality, never mentioning how easily the car could collapse in an accident. It wasn't until the late 1960s, after Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed and mounting public pressure, that the automotive industry began to acknowledge the dangers of cars like the Mainline. The Ford Mainline's legacy is inseparable from the era's disregard for safety. Thousands of Americans, mostly working-class families, suffered or died in these cars. They trusted the Ford name, believing that even a base model would protect them. But Ford had made a different calculation. Safety cost money, and budget cars couldn't afford it. The company knew the Mainline was structurally weak, but prioritized affordability and production speed. The same plant workers who assembled Ford's luxury models also built the Mainline, but with fewer welds, thinner metal, and no structural reinforcements. It was an unspoken truth in Detroit at the time. The poor bought the dangerous cars. Today, surviving Ford Mainlines are prized for restorers for their simple mechanics and nostalgic looks. Yet they also serve as a haunting reminder of an era when safety wasn't part of the conversation. Modern crash standards, crumple zones, reinforced door beams, padded dashboards, collapsible steering columns, all exist because of cars like this. The Ford Mainline was the product of an age that equated affordability with acceptability, even when lives were at stake. The 1952 to 1954 Ford Mainline may have been America's bargain car, but it was also one of its most lethal. It revealed the grim consequences of cutting corners in design and engineering. For low-income families of the 1950s, the Mainline was both a dream and a danger, a symbol of independence that too often became a symbol of tragedy. In the broader history of automotive safety, it stands as a sobering lesson. A car can be affordable, but when it's built without protection, it's the human body that pays the difference. Number 4. In the early 1950s, the Buick Roadmaster represented the height of American luxury, a symbol of wealth, success, and post-war optimism. It was a rolling monument to excess, wrapped in chrome and powered by a thunderous inline 8 or early V8 engine. But beneath the glamorous veneer, the Roadmaster was a death trap disguised as a luxury cruiser. Let's look at why this steel fortress became one of the most dangerous cars of its time. The Roadmaster's sheer bulk gave owners a false sense of invincibility. Weighing over 4,000 pounds and stretching more than 18 feet long, it looked indestructible. Drivers assumed its massive frame would protect them in a crash, but the opposite was true. The car's body-on-frame construction was incredibly rigid, with almost no energy-absorbing zones. In modern cars, crumple zones deform to absorb impact forces. The Roadmaster, however, simply transmitted all the collision energy directly into the occupants. In a head-on crash, the steering column, dashboard, and firewall didn't yield. The people inside did. Despite its weight and speed potential, the Roadmaster relied on weak drum brakes that faded dangerously under heat. In downhill or emergency stops, the brakes lost pressure, extending stopping distances by hundreds of feet. When you combine 4,000 pounds of moving steel with slow, fading brakes, the outcome in an emergency was almost always catastrophic. Drivers who couldn't stop in time faced the full brutality of 1950s automotive physics: no seatbelts, no airbags, and no crumple zones. Another notorious flaw was the solid steering column, mounted directly in line with the driver's chest. In a frontal impact, it often impaled the driver, a gruesome but well-documented phenomenon of the era. The hard steel dashboard offered no cushioning, so even moderate collisions could break jaws, skulls, or ribs as passengers were thrown forward. Buick, like many automakers of the time, prioritized styling and prestige over safety engineering. The phrase "safety sells" had not yet entered Detroit's vocabulary. The Roadmaster's soft suspension and over-assisted steering gave it a floating feel on the road, comfortable but dangerously disconnected. At high speeds, the car wallowed and leaned in corners, causing drivers to lose control during evasive maneuvers. Blowouts, which were common due to bias-ply tires, could send a car into uncontrollable spins or rollovers. Its high center of gravity and massive front bias meant that even a mild swerve could cause the vehicle to fishtail or tip on rural roads, where many fatal crashes occurred. By modern standards, the 1950 to 1953 Buick Roadmaster stands as a cautionary example of why mass and power do not equal safety. It was a car from a time before seatbelts were standard, before crash testing existed, and before consumer safety advocates like Ralph Nader challenged Detroit's negligence. While collectors today admire the Roadmaster's craftsmanship and grandeur, its engineering reveals how little manufacturers understood or cared about human survivability in crashes. The 1950 to 1953 Buick Roadmaster was a luxury icon built in an era of ignorance about safety. It was as beautiful as it was brutal, a car that could flatten obstacles on the road, but offered no mercy to the people inside when things went wrong. Its legacy serves as a chilling reminder that automotive progress is measured not just in horsepower, but in human lives saved. Number 3. In the early 1950s, the Dodge Coronet was sold as the perfect American family car, dependable, affordable, and built to last. Chrysler's advertising proudly emphasized the Coronet's ruggedness and its safe, sure handling. But as highways expanded and speeds increased, a darker truth emerged. This so-called family sedan was alarmingly unstable, slow to stop, and prone to deadly crashes in real-world driving conditions. Let's take a closer look at how the 1950 to 1954 Dodge Coronet became one of the most deceptively dangerous everyday cars of its time. In post-war America, Dodge positioned the Coronet as a durable, no-nonsense car for middle-class families. It was built on Chrysler's body-on-frame design, powered by the flathead six-cylinder engine and later by a modest V8. On paper, it sounded solid, a safe, sturdy choice for the average household. But solid didn't mean safe. The car's heavy steel structure offered no protection zones or reinforcement around the passenger cabin. In a collision, the force of impact transferred directly to the occupants. Even low-speed crashes could result in serious injuries due to the rigid frame and lack of restraint systems. Seatbelts were not yet standard, and the smooth vinyl bench seats only made matters worse by launching passengers forward during sudden stops. One of the Coronet's most serious flaws was its poor steering stability, particularly at higher speeds. The car used recirculating ball steering, which was sluggish and unresponsive, requiring multiple turns of the wheel to make a quick correction. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. When drivers swerved to avoid obstacles or made emergency maneuvers, the Coronet often oversteered or drifted uncontrollably. Add in the soft suspension and narrow bias-ply tires, and the result was a car that floated rather than tracked straight, especially on uneven or curving highways. On rural roads, where most families drove at 50 to 60 miles per hour, a single steering misjudgment could send the Coronet into a fatal spin or rollover. The Coronet's drum brakes were notoriously underpowered for the vehicle's size and weight. After repeated stops, they would overheat and lose friction, a phenomenon known as brake fade. Owners frequently reported that after driving downhill or braking hard multiple times, the pedal would sink with almost no stopping power. During an emergency stop, this could be catastrophic. In tests by automotive magazines of the era, the Coronet's stopping distances were among the longest in its class, especially when compared to lighter compacts or newer imports entering the U.S. market in the mid-1950s. Many fatal accidents involving Coronets were traced to loss of braking ability on hills or during high-speed stops, situations where even a few extra feet could mean life or death. The real danger wasn't just one defect, it was how they interacted. Imagine a family on a two-lane highway. A deer or another car suddenly appears ahead. The driver hits the brakes, but they fade. He jerks the wheel, but the steering is vague and delayed. By the time the car responds, it's already too late. Countless reports from the early 50s detail accidents where Coronets veered into ditches, trees, or oncoming traffic because drivers couldn't correct or stop in time. The irony is that Chrysler promoted the Coronet's dependable engineering in marketing, yet its braking and handling systems were grossly inadequate for the era's expanding road speeds. The mid-1950s brought growing awareness about car safety, but for thousands of families, those lessons came at a terrible cost. The 1950 to 1954 Dodge Coronet stands as a sobering reminder of an era when cars were built for durability, not survivability. Its poor steering stability and brake fade turned everyday driving into a gamble, especially for families who trusted its dependable reputation. It was a car that could carry a family, but not always safely home. Number 2. When the Oldsmobile 88 arrived in 1949, it changed the landscape of American motoring. It was a family sedan with a powerful V8 engine, one of the first muscle cars before the term even existed. Advertised with slogans like, "Make a date with a Rocket 88," it became the dream car for middle-class Americans who wanted speed and prestige at an affordable price. But what the ads didn't mention was that the Oldsmobile 88's performance far exceeded its safety. By combining immense horsepower with outdated brakes, suspension, and steering, Oldsmobile created a car that could outrun nearly anything on the road, yet couldn't stop or control itself safely. It became a lethal symbol of early American power obsession. Let's explore how the Olds 88's brilliance on paper became a death trap in practice. In 1949, General Motors launched the Rocket V8, a 303 cubic inch engine that produced 135 horsepower, astonishing for its time. The Oldsmobile 88 was the first to receive it, instantly giving the car performance on par with many sports cars. By the early 1950s, the engine's output climbed even higher, and the 88's reputation grew. It could reach 100 miles per hour when most sedans struggled to hit 80. The public loved it. Young drivers adored its acceleration, and NASCAR racers used it to dominate early stock car competitions. But what worked on the racetrack didn't translate to the highway. The average driver was now piloting a high-powered vehicle without modern safety features, and the result was carnage. The Oldsmobile 88's chassis dated back to pre-war designs, using a rigid live rear axle and soft coil springs. This combination offered comfort at low speeds, but became unstable during fast cornering. At high speeds, the rear end tended to hop or sway over bumps, throwing the car off balance. In emergency maneuvers, drivers often experienced severe oversteer, the rear end swinging violently outward, leading to spins and rollovers. Period drivers frequently described the 88 as feeling light in the tail and unpredictable on curves. Once traction was lost, recovery was nearly impossible, especially on narrow 1950s roads. Perhaps the deadliest flaw of all was the braking system. Despite its high-performance engine, the Oldsmobile 88 retained drum brakes on all four wheels, small, non-ventilated, and prone to overheating. During repeated or hard braking, they suffered from fade, losing friction and forcing the driver to press the pedal harder for less effect. At highway speeds, this meant stopping distances stretched to over 200 feet, far too long to avoid collisions. Combine that with soft suspensions and poor tire technology, and the result was chaos in emergencies. Many crashes involving the Olds 88 occurred not because of reckless driving, but because the brakes simply gave up when needed most. Oldsmobile's advertising proudly linked the 88 to aviation and rocket imagery, symbols of speed and progress. The car's name alone, Rocket 88, evoked power and excitement. But this marketing backfired in tragic ways. Thousands of owners, especially young men, were inspired to push the car to its limits. Yet highways in the early 1950s were narrow, two-lane roads with poor visibility and no guardrails. Accident records from the period showed a disproportionately high number of fatal crashes involving Oldsmobile 88s, especially among drivers under 30. Police and safety officials began calling it the rocket that couldn't land. By 1955, the Olds 88 had evolved into a more refined cruiser, but the fundamental safety flaws remained. It was still fast, still under-braked, and still built on an aging frame. The car's lethality helped fuel growing debates in Washington about automobile safety regulations as fatalities climbed nationwide. Though no single car was blamed, models like the Olds 88, powerful but uncontrollable, became case studies in why raw horsepower without engineering restraint was dangerous. The Oldsmobile 88's tragic contradiction, high speed, low control, forced engineers in later decades to take braking, balance, and suspension design seriously. Cars like the Chevrolet Corvette and Ford Thunderbird that followed incorporated better steering geometry, wider tires, and improved brake systems. But those lessons were written in blood. The 88's reputation as a family rocket that killed its drivers marked a grim chapter in the story of American automotive progress. The 1950 to 1955 Oldsmobile 88 was both revolutionary and ruinous, a car that redefined performance for the average driver, but ignored the physical limits of mid-century engineering. It offered power without safety, speed without control, and excitement without restraint. In the words of one 1953 automotive journalist, "The Rocket 88 gives you wings, but no way to land safely." It remains a cautionary symbol of America's early obsession with speed, when going fast mattered more than surviving the stop. Number 1. The Lincoln Capri, produced between 1952 and 1956, was a masterpiece of mid-century luxury design, powerful, massive, and dripping with prestige. It represented the post-war dream, chrome, horsepower, and status. Yet beneath its elegant lines lay a brutal truth. This was a car that could kill with terrifying ease. The Capri embodied everything glorious and dangerous about early American luxury cars: immense size, brute power, and a complete lack of safety engineering. It was a rolling fortress in appearance only. In reality, its combination of primitive handling, heavy construction, and lethal interior design made it one of the most unforgiving cars of its era. By the early 1950s, Lincoln was eager to shed its conservative image and compete with Cadillac and Packard. The Capri was its bold statement: long, low, and powered by a 317 cubic inch V8, later upgraded to 341 and 368 cubic inches. It could cruise at 100 miles per hour with ease and was advertised as a luxury car built for the open road. In truth, it was a 2-ton missile with 1950s brakes and steering that required the upper body strength of a lumberjack. Drivers praised its power, but quickly realized that once you got the Capri going fast, bringing it back under control was another matter entirely. One of the Lincoln Capri's most dangerous characteristics was its heavy, unassisted steering. Power steering was still a novelty in the early 50s, and many Capris lacked it, especially the earlier models. At low speeds, drivers had to wrestle the wheel just to park. At high speeds, the massive steering box made turning slow and unpredictable. On winding highways, the Capri's slow steering ratio made evasive maneuvers almost impossible. If a deer ran into the road or another car braked suddenly, the driver often couldn't turn in time to avoid disaster. Even those who tried risked overcorrecting and sending the car into a spin. Lincoln proudly touted the Capri's massive construction and road-hugging weight. The truth was that its 4,300-pound mass was a double-edged sword. While it made the car feel stable on straight roads, it also increased kinetic energy in crashes. When a Capri struck another car, the smaller vehicle usually crumpled completely, but the Capri's rigid frame transferred the full force of impact into its passengers. Unlike later unibody cars, the Capri's body-on-frame design had no crumple zones. In a head-on collision, the steel frame held firm while the occupants absorbed the shock. Survivors often suffered crushed chests and internal injuries, not because the car failed structurally, but because it refused to absorb any of the impact energy. The Capri's interior, like many cars of its day, was a gallery of hazards. Its dashboard was made of solid metal, shaped in sharp edges and adorned with chrome trim. The steering column, long and rigid, had no collapsible design. In a frontal crash, the steering column often acted like a spear, driving straight into the driver's chest or skull. Crash investigations from the period revealed that steering wheel intrusion was a frequent cause of death in Lincoln accidents. Passengers fared no better. There were no seat belts, and the plush bench seats offered no lateral support. During a sudden stop, occupants were thrown violently into the dash or windshield. The glass, not yet laminated for safety, often shattered into razor-like shards. Lincoln marketed the Capri as a car of supreme comfort and confidence. It had a smooth ride, a powerful V8, and high-speed touring ability. But this comfort created a deadly illusion. Drivers felt secure, even as they were piloting a dangerously unstable vehicle. The car's weight and quiet cabin masked how hard the suspension and tires were working at speed. On curving highways or during emergency braking, the Capri's soft springs and high center of gravity could make it sway violently or fishtail. Rollover incidents were not uncommon, especially when a front tire blew out. Even more frightening was brake fade. After several hard stops, the all-drum braking system overheated, reducing friction dramatically. Many fatal crashes occurred simply because the brakes failed to respond when needed most. By the 1955, the Capri's V8 had grown to 225 horsepower, serious performance for its time. It could easily outpace most other sedans on the road. Yet the fundamental problems of weight, braking, and steering remained unchanged. Crash records from the mid-1950s showed that the Capri was involved in a disproportionate number of fatal highway collisions relative to its production numbers. Drivers who loved its power often overestimated their control, and when the limits came, the consequences were deadly. Emergency responders often described post-crash Capris as twisted tanks, their exterior mostly intact, but their occupants fatally injured by the steering column, dashboard, or blunt force trauma from within. The Capri's legacy foreshadowed the coming safety revolution of the late 1950s and 1960s. Engineers began to realize that raw power and luxury features were meaningless without structural crash protection. By the 1960s, collapsible steering columns, padded dashboards, and front seat belts became standard. Innovations born from the blood-soaked lessons of cars like the Capri. The Capri remains an important symbol of that transition, the moment when American carmakers learned that luxury and speed demanded responsibility. The 1952 to 1956 Lincoln Capri was, in many ways, a magnificent car. Powerful, elegant, and built to impress. But it was also a machine of contradictions. Fast yet unmanageable, solid yet deadly in a crash. It stands as a reminder of an era when American carmakers chased prestige and horsepower without understanding the consequences. The Capri didn't just reflect the glamour of the early 1950s. It reflected the danger of believing that weight and power alone equaled safety. In the words of one 1954 safety engineer, "The Lincoln Capri is built like a fortress, but inside that fortress, there are no survivors."